Hi, chess friends. This is Sir Glenn again, back to the chess lessons that we are having. Last time we have the lesson about the Sicilian Dragon, part one of the main line. Now we will discuss the part two, but just in case you haven't watched the part one, I highly recommend that you watch part one so you would understand the discussion that we're having. Okay, so basically the moves are e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, cd4, knight takes d4, g6, bishop e3, bishop g7, f3, knight c6, queen d2, castle kingside, bishop c4, bishop d7, castle queenside, rook c8, bishop b3, knight e5, and h4. And after which, I would recommend the knight c4 line, which is would go knight c4, bishop takes, rook takes, h5, knight takes pawn, g4, knight f6, and bishop h6. Now we've been discussing the line starting from the black sacrifice of knight takes e4. Now I was considering knight takes e4 and what would happen if white would play knight takes e4. So we have discussed that. Black will reply rook takes d4, queen h2, bishop e5, and queen h4, which is the strongest reply. Just in case, I would like to also mention if f4, black will reply with rook takes d1 and there are two ways here: king takes d1 and rook takes d1. Let's first discuss king takes d1. If king takes d1 happens, then bishop takes g4, king c1 getting out of check, and then bishop takes b2. Well, this looks like black is giving up a piece, but actually black wins a pawn because after king takes b2, queen b6 check, and king c1, even king a1, um, sorry, what black can still recover the lost piece by forking the king and the knight. So if king c1, that's queen e3. Well, if king a1, then that will be queen d4 check, and white will still mean black will still be able to regain the lost piece. So let's go to queen e3 or king c1, queen e3, king b1, queen takes e4, and after the checks on f8 and h7, black will simply play king e8, and I would certainly say that black is better here because of the even though the material of the exchange of rook against bishop and four pawns is, I think, more than enough sufficient compensation. Well, let's now proceed with rook takes d1. So instead of king takes d1, it's rook takes d1. Black answers the same way: bishop takes b2, king takes b2, and then bishop takes g4, ignoring the threat on the rook on f8, because after bishop takes rook, bishop takes d1. Um, I would say the uh, the subsequent play would favor black because of the number of pawns that black has. So let's try to go back. Now instead of f4, let's look at bishop f4. Well, bishop f4 is simply inferior because after takes and then checks on d1, black plays f6 and he is simply ahead in material. Basically, he is ahead 2 pawns against white. So let's try to go back. So queen h4, let me just do a summary here. Black can defend two ways. It's either with rook takes e4, queen b6 is also a possibility, but I guess it would not be quite would confuse matters because after queen takes e7, even though black has a terrific sacrifice starting with queen takes b2, king takes b2, rook takes e4, well, I would consider it's quite confusing and black may be lost along the way. Although after the subsequent move, black has some compensation, and also after king c2, black will recover the pawn, but instead would be uh, would be giving white the advantage of the exchange. So instead of having that rook takes e4, white will simply have to keep it simple by playing f takes e4, queen b6, e3, rook c8, bishop d2, and bishop e6, just ignoring the attack on the h7 because it's nothing. Let's say, for example, queen takes h7, king f8, and white continues with bishop h6 check. Black will simply run away with king e8 and king d7, and there's nothing um, that white can do to harass black's king any further. So after rook takes d1, king takes d1, Black can also, so instead of sacrificing rook in e4, black can also defend simply by playing rook takes d1, king takes d1, and f5, because after the checks on f8, knight g5, queen b6. After the check on h8, I believe black's two bishops plus a very active queen against white's king would be more than enough sufficient counterplay for the down in the exchange. So let's try to go back. After knight takes e4, the most recommended move here would be to play queen e3. Okay, it's quite surprising, but it's the correct move. And after rook takes, and black is recommended to play here rook takes c3, sacrificing the exchange again in order to prevent knight d5 by white in case the attack on the h file would continue. Because let's say, for example, black plays knight f6 um, instead of rook takes c3, then um, black is doomed to fail because of this follow-up. Knight e4 or knight d5. And black's h7 pawn, and eventually the king will fall. So let's try to go back. The recommended move is rook takes c3, pawn takes rook, knight f6, bishop takes g7, and then king takes h7. Now there's a parting of ways here. The most recommended part is rook h2, actually, after bishop, not bishop takes g7. Another line would run either rook h4 or rook h2, with the idea of doubling the rooks. Okay, that's one line, but the main line is takes on g7 and then check on h6. Well, also rook h2 is quite more recommended, because after here, black must be accurate and play king h8. That's the correct move. If black goes to g8, then he is bound to fail, because after pawn to g5 and block the knight on h5, white will simply sacrifice the exchange on h5 and then open the h file again. And suddenly, at the moment where black feels secure because he has covered the h7 square, well, you can pause the video and think for yourself, but this fails to a very simple tactic. Knight takes bishop, queen takes knight, and then g6, with the idea of if black takes on g6, rook g5. So after king h8, which is more better, after g5, knight h5, rook takes on h5, and then rook h1, well, rook queen c8 does not work, because after takes here, the rook on f8 is not guarded and black will be mated. But instead of playing the queen on c8, black can play rook g8, and after takes on h5, rook h7, and all the weaknesses is covered. And eventually black will activate the queen on b6 and a5, creating some counterplay on white's king. Also, let me just mention that queen e3 before pushing g5 is also possible, but the same defensive maneuver is it will work for black. So after g5 and h5, knight e2, and sending knight f4, rook g7, and then a exchange on f4, bishop e6, black can eventually the black's king is secured, and white can eventually secure counterplay by moving his queen out to attack white's king. All right. Okay, so instead of the pawn sacrifice on h5, what about if white plays g4? Preferring the slow attack compared to the swashbuckling pawn sacrifice on h5. Well, black has to be careful here. If he just moves around and try to race with white by playing queen a5, then white gains a very um, good edge here, starting with h5, rook fc8, knight d3, and black's queen doesn't have any good square for the queen. Queen e5 is met by f4, and queen a6 and queen c7 should be met by capture on g6 and then e5. Let's say, for instance, queen a6 is played. After capture on g6, even f takes g6 would encounter the same response e5 as well as h takes g6. And after e5, black has nothing better but to play knight takes to g4, pawn takes knight, rook takes e3. But there's nothing here after capture on c3 and a2. White simply plays e6, and according to Stockfish, Rybka, and Houdini, white gains the upper hand here. So instead of the hasty queen a5, I would recommend black to play b5 instead. Here, if white tries to capture on b5, then black can gain some momentum because of the lost time by playing queen a5. And then after knight d4, he gains a very important tempo. Rook fc8, h5, and then takes on c3 would now be very effective. So after rook takes c3, pawn takes rook, queen a3 check. There's a very interesting combination here. If if black checks on b8 with the idea of mating white on b2 square, white would simply cover with the knight. But here, black has a very incredible combination here, starting with the knight sacrifice on e4, knight takes pawn, with the idea of eliminating the knight on d4. So after pawn takes knight, bishop takes knight, black wins by checking on b8 next move. So instead of knight takes b5, which gives black precious time, I would recommend white to play h5 instead, and a race begins. After b4, knight ce2, queen a5, king b1, and rook fc8, and a mutual capture in g6. It should be considered equal chances for both sides. Well, I would certainly consider black here because of the more active position of black's rooks and queen. Okay, so instead of white's g4, sometimes white can also play king b1. If king b1, black gains precious time, and queen a5 now works. Now white has to play knight b3 to cover the queen side and eliminate the aggressive position of black's queen. But after queen c7, and the normal g4 doesn't work because of b5, and after h5, b4. So black's counterplay comes just in time. So as you can see, the dragon mainline variation is a well-respected line, and I'm pretty sure with black's player very aware of, if white tries to play the fast h5 pawn sacrifice, you know how to react. And if he chooses to play this slow but sure attack g4 h5, the key position here is to rather to be creative and not be afraid to push the pawn on b5 and b4 in order to gain precious time and get your counterplay going. So again, thank you for watching my video. Don't forget to hit on like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching, and wait again for my next installation of the Sicilian Dragon series. Bye.